Okay, so now that we've finished the hydrogen walkthrough, I wanted to quickly take a deeper look at some of the things that we learned, and I'm going to start with the streaming server-side rendering. So this is a post by Dan Abramov that he did back in June of last year, and this is basically describing the way that streaming server-side rendering is going to work. And I'm going to walk through this as quick as possible. It's a long article, but he basically starts out talking about how server-side rendering happens on its own. So you, on the server, fetch the data for the entire app, then render on the server, render the entire app to HTML, send it in the response, then on the client, load the JavaScript code for the whole app, then on the client, connect the JavaScript logic, basically hydrate everything. And the key to that is that each step had to finish for the entire app at once before the next could start. It's like the waterfall effect. This is not efficient if some of your parts of your app are slower than others. And so what they've done is React 18 is going to let us use suspense to break down our app into smaller independent units that can go through these steps independently from each other and won't block the rest of the app. This is the non-blocking first render that I mentioned in an earlier video. So let's talk about just a basic server-side rendering. They're showing here the green squares represent a fully hydrated, fully interactive page. And hydration just means that all of the event handlers and the on-clicks and the listeners are all loaded and everything's working and the page is interactive to the client, to the person who's loading and looking at the page. So the problem with it is if you don't use server-side rendering, the only thing the user is going to see while the JavaScript loads is a blank page, and that's not good. And so what server-side rendering lets you do is show the HTML first, but it's basically showing all of the HTML, and then it waits for everything to hydrate, and then interaction can happen. And he's basically saying that a server-side rendering on its own doesn't really make the app any faster. It makes it feel better to the user that they're seeing something happening, basically. So what's the problems with server-side rendering on its own? He talks about 3 problems. First is you have to fetch everything before you show anything. The second is you have to load everything before you can hydrate anything. And the third is you have to hydrate everything before you can interact with anything. So how do we solve these problems? And this was their way. And the common thing that they noticed was that there's a waterfall that was mentioned earlier. And it has to go 1, 2, 3, 4. And the solution was to try to break that apart so that it's a non-blocking render so that each part can render in their own stages. And he also mentions that there's prior frameworks that have tried this before, but not quite the way that they're doing it now. So the first problem will be solved with streaming HTML. This is the streaming part of streaming server-side rendering. There's 2 major server-side rendering features in React 18 unlocked by the suspense component. The first being streaming HTML, and the second is selective hydration on the client. The streaming HTML is on the server. And basically the streaming HTML is going to come in pieces. By wrapping comments, these are the comments here, with the suspense component, you're telling React that it doesn't need to wait for the comments to start streaming the HTML for the rest of the page. And there's no HTML for the comments in the initial bundle that's received. And unlike traditional HTML streaming, it doesn't have to be in the top-down order. So you can send the HTML early, but there's still a problem because until all the JavaScript loads, you can't hydrate any part of the app. So to avoid this, you would use code splitting, and you would specify that a piece of code doesn't need to load synchronously. You do something asynchronously. But in React 18, suspense lets us hydrate the app before the comment or the JavaScript is fully loaded. And this is an example of selective hydration, which basically means that now you will be able to have sections of these pages are fully interactive. They're fully clickable, but yet this section here, which might have some heavy JavaScript, still hasn't loaded, but these will all be interactive, which solves the second problem because you no longer have to wait for all the code to load in order to start hydrating each part. And as they're showing here, you're on a page that has this streaming server-side rendering. You can actually click a hydrated component while a different component is still hydrating. And instead of there being any delay, the click is handled immediately and the browser doesn't appear to be stuck during a long hydration. So that's something that's new. And then here, they're basically showing that if you now have two components that are in the process of hydrating, but a user clicks on one of them, the hydration will switch to prioritize the click component, which is definitely different and solves the third problem because React starts hydrating everything as early as possible and prioritizes the most urgent part of the screen based on the user's interaction, like I just mentioned. And so, yeah, there's also a demo that is an example of exactly what this article is talking about, and you can see it here. And I've forked the example so that I can edit the delays here. So when I go ahead and refresh here, what you're going to see is that the comments will be delayed, but everything else is going to show on its own. So the HTML comes in first, and even the HTML for the comments comes in first. So the title comes in and the JavaScript hasn't loaded yet. And I can increase this and play around with this and get this to go for 4 seconds instead of 2 seconds. It kind of takes a second, but once I do that, you'll see that this is going to take even longer. If I just got to wait for a minute, let it reload itself. So when it loads this time, it's going to take 4 seconds, but we can see everything out here has already loaded. And if there was another part, if this is clickable, we can go ahead and click any part of this and the click will happen immediately because everything else is already hydrated. Okay, so moving on, I wanted to show this. This is another demo that's a server component demo. And you will have to log in when you get here, but basically it's just a note to do, it's like a note-taking to-do app. And you can come in here and say, testing with Philip. You can add your note here, play around with the network tab, kind of just get a sense of how everything's working. Okay, done. So that's going to be here. So you can come here and play around with this if you like. This is the initial comments on server components for Hydrogen. So initially they talked about Hydrogen used a reverse engineered version of server components, which supported context and server-side rendering in Hydrogen. And in order to get everything fully working, they needed to wait for this work to be done. However, there's been a recent announcement and they've mentioned that they've been working with Facebook, Meta, the React team, and have aligned on a path forward. And Hydrogen will be adopting the experimental version or Facebook's version of server components. And this was going to require changes to Hydrogen. Most notably, Hydrogen is only going to support context in client components only. There was initially supposed to be server context. And that's where they're saying until we have a stronger alignment on server context. Also, React Router is going to be removed. And Hydrogen is now using a file-based routing system, which is similar to Next.js, where any component added to the pages directory is automatically registered as a route. And that's very similar, if not identical, to the way things work in Next.js. So it's nice to keep things similar in that regard. One thing I just kind of wanted to point out here is this was just a quick comment, an article about server components. And this is talking about how they are zero bundle. And one way you might want to use this is when you're utilizing third-party packages, they're adding to the bundle size, of course. So like they're showing here, when you take this third-party package and make it a server component instead, you're going to be saving a good amount of data. So then I also wanted to show that streaming server-side rendering and the React server components are actually both available in Next.js. You have to do a few extra steps to enable them, which I can show here. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but this page shows how you would enable that. There's a few differences, and you would just kind of have to poke around to figure those out. This is the way you would enable the server components. And also, there's an ability to use Hydrogen components in Next.js, as Josh Larson from Shopify is pointing out that the majority of Hydrogen components accept data from the storefront API and render just like a normal React component. So you can use Hydrogen hooks and components in other frameworks like Next.js. So although it's possible to do, after reading, through this and some comments in the Discord, it is pretty clunky right now. So it's not exactly streamlined, but it is going to be possible, and it will get more streamlined over time. So this is how you would go about installing Hydrogen in your Next.js app. You're going to have a React Router DOM, and they're getting rid of React Router. So there's a lot of things that are going to change and move around. And they mention a few of these, and they talk about some of the limitations, like there's no use shop query. They recommend writing a utility, like a get Shopify data utility instead, and basically ends up utilizing GraphQL. And whenever I work with Next.js with Shopify, I've always worked with GraphQL. So that would be nothing new for me and totally familiar. And saying Hydrogen might introduce a utility function in the future. There's some people down here that have already written these utility functions. I believe this guy, and they've had some problems with them. So it also mentions that there's no server components, and that Hydrogen, this was back in November. So Hydrogen was using a modified version of server components, but now, as I mentioned in that Discord announcement, they're going to adopt the React core version. And there's also issues once React introduces server context. This limitation will no longer apply, but there's no alignment yet on server context. So there's still a lot of things up in the air moving forward. And one of the last things I wanted to show is this is the Shopify devs Discord channel. And this is a really good place to, number one, connect with a bunch of other Shopify developers. And in the Hydrogen chat and the announcements channel, this chat specifically, there's a lot of good information, and it's updating every day, and the developers are actively utilizing the new updated ways and running into bugs and fixing and debugging. And so it's almost a necessary place if you're going to be developing and understanding exactly what's going on with Hydrogen right now. So, thanks for watching all of these videos. I hope I've taught someone something, and I hope you learned something, and I will see you in my next video.